The accusation struck the sterile air of the hospital corridor like a slap. A sharp voice rang out, filled with indignation and authority, declaring that the nurse was suspended immediately. The word hung there, suspended, like a verdict handed down in the middle of a battlefield, cold, final, merciless. And at the center of it all, an 82-year-old man sat hunched in a wheelchair, his trembling hands gripping the armrests, his chest laboring for breath. His uniform was long gone, but the quiet gravity in his eyes told the story of a soldier who had once stood unflinching in the face of fire. Now, in the twilight of his life, he was being left to fend for himself, abandoned in a place that was supposed to heal, not humiliate. The nurse, young but steady, had bent the rules for him. She had seen him collapse, heard the rasp in his throat, and moved without hesitation. She had fetched water when protocol demanded paperwork, steadied his faltering frame when regulations insisted on waiting for clearance. She had placed humanity above bureaucracy, and for that she was condemned. The supervisor's words cut through the hallway with icy precision, and the silence that followed was filled with invisible judgment. Bystanders, other staff, patients, visitors, shifted uneasily but said nothing. The nurse stood still, her chest rising and falling with restrained defiance. The veteran's watery eyes searched the floor, but behind them a storm brewed. He was used to silence. Silence had been his companion in foxholes, in the moments before the charge, in the nights when the memories of fallen brothers clawed at his sleep. Silence had been the blanket under which he had hidden his grief, after returning home to a nation too busy to notice his scars. And silence was his answer now, though his dignity screamed louder than any protest. Decades earlier, he had worn the green fatigues of an infantryman. The smell of gunpowder had clung to his skin. The weight of the rifle had bent his shoulders, and the sound of mortar shells had vibrated in his bones. He had watched men younger than he fall in mud and blood, their last breaths carried away on foreign winds. He had carried their names etched into his memory, a roll call of ghosts he still whispered each night before sleep. His own body bore the reminders. Knees that buckled after too many forced marches, lungs scarred by exposure. A heart that skipped like a faulty drum. He had returned alive, but not untouched, never untouched. When he had come back, the world had not cheered. The parades were smaller, the gratitude muted, the promises of care quickly buried in the avalanche of red tape. He had worked quietly, raised a family, buried a wife, and lived with the humility of one who had seen too much. His medals sat in a wooden box, gathering dust. He never boasted of them, never sought recognition. But today, as his chest heaved in that bright corridor, and his nurse stood accused of kindness, the truth of who he was threatened to break the silence. The supervisor's lips curled with a kind of bureaucratic satisfaction. Rules had been broken, the nurse would pay the price. And the old man, well, he was just another patient, another bed to be managed, another file to be shuffled into compliance. The onlookers lowered their eyes, unwilling to clash with authority, unwilling to risk their own standing. Injustice thrives in silence, and silence filled that hallway like a suffocating fog. The nurse did not plead. She stood straight, though her hands trembled at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of conviction rather than rebellion. She did not argue the rules. She spoke only of humanity, but her words fell into the void, dismissed with a wave of the supervisor's hand. Security was summoned, and the tension tightened like a noose. The veteran inhaled slowly, each breath a battle. He wanted to speak, to lift his voice in her defense, but his throat locked. Instead, his hand moved, shaking but deliberate, slipping into his pocket. His fingers brushed against a worn leather wallet. Inside, folded and creased from decades of wear, rested a photograph of his unit. Young faces frozen in sepia, most of them now long buried. And beside it, a small card embossed with an emblem most in that room would not recognize. His hand lingered there, steadying himself, as though touching those relics connected him to a strength beyond the moment. The nurse escorted away, caught his gaze before disappearing around the corner. Her eyes did not plead for rescue. They held only the quiet hope that dignity would not be erased by silence. Minutes dragged. The supervisor busied herself with papers, convincing herself that order had been restored. But then, the air shifted. Footsteps echoed with a rhythm not born of haste but of authority. They were measured, deliberate, and they carried a weight that drew every eye in the corridor. Into the sterile hall stepped a man whose uniform was unmistakable. Dark, pressed, adorned with stars that glimmered under the fluorescent lights. 4 of them, a general. The silence deepened, the supervisor's face drained of color. Nurses froze mid-step, and visitors instinctively straightened their posture, as though respect were demanded by his very presence. The general's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept the room. He did not speak at first. He did not need to. His gaze landed on the veteran, frail in his chair but upright in spirit, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, respect, brotherhood that transcended years and ranks. The general approached slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped before the old soldier. He bent slightly, lowering himself to meet the veteran's eyes. Without a word, he raised his hand in salute. The corridor stilled, time itself pausing to bear witness. The frail veteran's hand, trembling yet resolute, rose in return. It was not the salute of weakness, but of unbroken honor. Only then did the general turn, his voice carrying the weight of command that had once moved battalions. He asked what had transpired. The supervisor stammered, her authority crumbling under the gravity of his presence. She spoke of rules, of procedures, of infractions. The general listened, his expression unmoved. Then, slowly, he shook his head. His words cut through the air like a blade of truth. A soldier's life is not bound by paperwork. A nurse's compassion is not a crime. Murmurs stirred among the onlookers, a tide of awakening conscience. The general did not raise his voice, but his words resounded in every heart present. He spoke of sacrifice, of silent service that goes unseen, of the debt owed to those who had carried the weight of freedom on their shoulders. And then he turned to the supervisor, his eyes like steel. He did not berate. He did not shout. He simply asked how history would remember those who chose rules over humanity, procedure over honor. The question was not answered. It did not need to be. The supervisor lowered her gaze, the strength gone from her posture, her authority reduced to dust. The nurse was summoned back, her suspension lifted before it had even begun. She returned with quiet composure, but her eyes glistened with restrained emotion. The general placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder, firm and steady, a gesture of solidarity that spoke more than words could. Around them, the hallway transformed. Visitors stood taller, nurses wiped tears they had not realized had fallen. The veteran did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was his weapon, his shield, his final act of defiance against a world too quick to forget. The general's presence had restored the balance, but the old soldier's quiet dignity had been the spark that demanded it. Later, as the general prepared to leave, he looked once more at the veteran. In a voice low but firm, he uttered words that would linger in the corridor long after he was gone. The measure of a nation is how it treats those who served it when they can serve no more. And with that he walked away, leaving a trail of awe in his wake. The nurse remained by the veteran's side, no longer afraid of reprimand. She knew in that moment that compassion was never wasted, that standing for humanity even when punished carried the weight of true honor. The veteran's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes glistening not with weakness but with pride. For once he was not invisible, and those who witnessed it carried the memory with them. They told the story to friends, to families, to strangers, until it spread beyond the walls of that hospital. A story of an old soldier, a courageous nurse, and a general who reminded them all that dignity is not a privilege but a right. In the end, justice had not come through arguments or defiance. It had come through the silent strength of one who had given everything, and through the recognition of another who still carried the authority to make the world pause in respect. The power of silence had prevailed, and those who had once stood mute in the face of injustice now found their voices. So to those who hear this story, remember, silent dignity speaks louder than the harshest accusations. Sacrifice is not measured in medals, but in the quiet endurance of those who gave their youth for freedom. And honor, though often forgotten, always returns to claim its rightful place. Wherever you are listening, take a moment to reflect. Share where you are from, share what you felt as you heard this. Because stories like these remind us not only of those who fought on distant battlefields, but of those who continue fighting for dignity here at home. Subscribe, share, and remember, true heroes rarely demand recognition, they simply endure, and in their silence, they teach us how to stand.